Annik, where are you? That was an absolutely terrific presentation. And it could not have set up what I'm going to talk about better. Thank you. Thank you. So, first of all, I'm so excited to be here with you in Athens. And in the last couple of days, I've had an opportunity to have a number of conversations that have inspired the topic that I'm here to speak about, which is, what have we learned from issues of diversity and inclusion and the work we've been doing in organizations over the last, particularly 30 years, that could help us inspire innovation around sustainability. And Annik, your presentation and what Unilever is doing is such a wonderful example of not just looking at sustainability, but leveraging diversity and really making sure that everyone is not only a part of the thinking, but is a part of the images that we see and the future that we imagine. So what I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes is focus on, first, what are some of the definitions that we're working with around diversity, equity, inclusion, and I'm going to add the A, ability. And what are the ways in which we have learned from that inspire innovation? What is some of the research around that? And what is our call to action? What is that will inspire us? And so, let me sharpen my way of seeing so that we can see this together. One thing that I am convinced of is that from whatever country or cultures that we come from, that there is one thing that we all can resonate with. And that is that we sustain ourselves through relationships, through empathy, through music, and really knowing and seeing each other. So I bring the perspective of a social scientist. I study systems. I work with systems. And inclusive cultures are what we need to make sure that people are bringing their fullest contributions. And there are many parallels between what we've been learning around sustainability and diversity. So at a high level, one of the things that we think about is, what is the paradigm shift that we need in order to respond to the situations that are urgent and important in our lives now? And so at a very high level, we're moving from a perspective of extracting, so extracting resources, seeing people as what do we extract from them, to seeing interrelationships and renewability, both around people and around resources. From a discrete to a systemic perspective, and from a deficit, what are we losing? What do we have to cut back on? To growth and enhancement. And so those are the three paradigm shifts that I want you to keep in mind as I talk. And I welcome your questions and interruptions as I go along. Who is this? Greta. Does everybody know who this person is? So somebody tell me what you've heard about her in the last 2 weeks.
She sailed to New York on a ship. She sailed to New York on a ship.
She sailed to New York on a ship. What else?
But a lot of bad comments, like she's the way she's speaking, the way she looks, that somebody manipulates her. A lot of bad comments, mainly in social media. About her. She's young, she's too short, she's baggy, I don't know. A lot of
She gave Trump the eagle eye.
She did. But let's talk about what's most important. Who would have thought that leadership around the urgency of what we need to do around our climate, the challenge and the call to action, would come from a 16-year-old? Who would have imagined that that would have been the source of leadership? And so I take us from Greta to beyond, which is I could have shown you a slide of inspired leaders, people who are doing work around sustainability and diversity. I would have put your name up there. But what I want to do is turn to you and recognize that this takes each and every one of us. And if I could, I would have put a slide of all your faces up there. Because as you listen, I want you to think about and notice, what is it that I can do or notice differently walking away today? Not just from me, not just from the inspired lineup of speakers that Michael has arranged, but every single one of you in the room. We all need to learn from each other and leverage that in order to address the issues that are urgent today. So the questions are we listening? And are we ready? Whoops. Whoops. So, as we think about the words inclusion, Michael, would you read the Greek word for me? Inclusion. One of the things that's really interesting is this is a great example of the best of intentions don't always achieve what they were intended to achieve. Because as I was preparing my presentation, I had an insight. And my insight was, I'm going to be limited by the English language. How do I acknowledge that not only are there many different languages in the room, but that the words in my language don't always translate? So I did my best effort of translating the words inclusion and belonging. Michael? Yeah. So I was at my hotel, and I was talking to the manager, who is, when he's not a manager, he's a philosopher. Great example of we are so much more than who we show up with in our position. And I showed him these words, and he said to me, you know, that version of belonging, let me tell you what it means. It means fitting in, doing what you need. Is that for the Greek speakers in the room, is that what it means? That is not what I was wanting to say. That is actually almost a polar opposite to what I wanted to say. So what a great example of our best intentions of translating cannot be done by just using Google. And so what I want to use this as an example today of how, when we're talking about inclusion and belonging, the way we make sense of it is all together.
Well, are you also saying that you want, instead of just fitting in, you want the person to feel empowered and creative?
So for those of you who may not be able to hear Dr. Piasecki.
Just a second, have a microphone so everybody can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, well, Ilene and I have known each other for many years. So you set up how English itself, I can break things. You set up how English itself is restricting, but I think the audience needs to know what you mean by belonging, and are you suggesting that belonging is a person empowered and creative in fitting in?
So thank you, Bruce, and I'm going to be unfolding that.
Okay.
And what I'm saying right now is sometimes we're constrained by the translation and by the word. And the word belonging has become the next level iteration around the languaging of diversity, equity, inclusion, and it encompasses belonging, and I will speak to that. But let me ask a question first. How many of you have some familiarity and engagement around diversity intentionally where you work? So these terms are familiar to you? And what about the word inclusion? Is that a familiar and good? Okay, so I'm going to go through these definitions quite quickly, but the framework that we're all familiar with, I think, is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And as you see, there is, these circles are interconnecting, you know that. That you can't talk about any one of these, and these are only 5 of the 17 SDGs, but you can't talk about any one of these without looking at their interrelationship. That's the paradigm shift that I talked about, from discrete to systemic, interrelated. And so when we talk about connecting diversity, equity, and inclusion with sustainability, we could say that we're focusing on people. But what we know, and what we just saw with this wonderful case of Unilever, is that people, diverse experiences, perspectives, is very much interrelated with what it is that we need to create around addressing global inequities and being able to tap fully our resources of people. And so when we look at diversity, oftentimes the first thing people think about is gender. Would you agree? It may have also been that first entry point that we talked about. And yet, diversity, when I show up in front of you, I hope that you notice that I am a woman. I'm sorry, that was supposed to wake you up a little bit. But I take that because for many, many years I had a colleague that talked about one aspect of his identity that was ethnic. And he said in the United States, I don't share that part of myself until I get to know people. Because I don't want that to have a shadow over how they think of me and how they see me. So I want you to consider for just a moment, what about you do you feel like you have to hold back before you come to work? Because you don't want it to take away from how people see you as fully committed and fully being able to bring yourself fully to work. So this list is by no means thorough, but it shows many of the ways in which we are complex, that we are multitudes. And for any one of these dimensions, we are similar to other people and different from other people. But we are uniquely, each and every one of us, are uniquely the combination of ways in which we were born into this world and ways in which we've acquired. So those are two levels of diversity that are differentiated in research around diversity and innovation. So race, I came into this world as a white woman, white young girl, white baby, and yet and of the generation cohort that I was. But the job function, the parental status, other things about me may differ, and you may differ over time. So equity, and I'm saying these definitions just so that we have the same starting place, that equity is ensuring that we have equal access and that it requires that when we're looking at issues of equity, particularly in our organizations, that we deeply examine the procedures, policies, and practices that impact the distribution of resources. And more often than not, we don't notice ways in which there are historical, differentiated impacts of certain policies and practices until we listen. And we need to address the historical disparities in order to create the cultures of inclusion. So inclusion is about the culture. Diversity, if I might say, is who is being invited to the party. Inclusion is who's deciding on what music is being played, who's deciding on what food is being served, who's deciding on the ways in which I experience that I matter. And one of the examples I think about when it comes to inclusion is, think about this. Think about a time when there was a very important meeting being scheduled. And because of busy schedules, you were not able to attend that meeting, right? I'm seeing some nods. And so somebody said, don't worry, we'll send you the notes. How often have you heard that? We'll send you the notes. Well, here's the issue with that. And that is that old paradigm of discrete, as opposed to the new paradigm of seeing the interconnectedness among us, the interweaving, and how we make sense of things when we're together in the same room together. So inclusion is around acknowledging that it matters that you're there with us, influencing what's happening at the table. Now, that scenario around the invitation only gets a little more impactful when somebody says to you, I'll send you the notes. And then George comes by, and George says, oh, I can't make that meeting. I have a conflict. And the immediate response is, oh, we better reschedule. You know? So what makes for that difference, right? I see a lot of nods in the room. So when we talk about language, language creates our experience. Images create our experience. So when we talk about diversity, it's around those differences. We talk about equity, it's about making sure that there are not disparities and there's access. When we talk about inclusion, we're talking about the culture that we're creating. And I'm just going to put in a little, it's kind of an advertisement, but it's for a free resource. I'm a part of a global group called the Diversity Collegium that has created benchmarks for inclusion. And one of the new benchmarks that was created 2-3 years ago includes the benchmarks around diversity and sustainability. So we had a gathering of 70 people around the globe to look at how diversity, equity, and inclusion can address some of the challenges that we have today around the globe. And we added the term A for ability. And I understand that in many circumstances you're saying, how many different words, acronyms can we have? But it's important to recognize different abilities, different access, as our speaker just did. So when we talk about issues and concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm not going to speak to these specifics, but these are the ways in which this conversation alerts us, like the canary in the coal mine, that the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion has alerted us to look at things that help us create cultures where we are benefiting from the best of all of us. It's all about how we listen to each other, and how we talk to each other. And so the frame of belonging, coming back to that frame of belonging, goes beyond intentionality around creating an inclusive culture. Belonging is that sense that this is a place that I could call home. That this is a place where I can bring myself fully. So there are a lot of different approaches that we've taken to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the 5 approaches that you see up here are not instead of each other. Oftentimes they're interrelated and build on each other. Sometimes the entrance point comes from legislation, from rules and needing to follow rules. That's where compliance comes in. Do we have the right numbers? And in some instances, we have to look at numbers to address historical disparities. Then there's competence. And one of the concerns that comes up is that when we talk about being mindful around diversity, that in some ways we need to compromise our standards. And what we've been learning is it is far from that truth. It is far from that. That if anything, we are benefiting from having diversity in terms of our thinking, in terms of our creativity, and in terms of our innovation. And so it became critical, and this has been my work for most of my career, to look at what do we create as a culture in the organization? What are the changes that we have to make to be able to welcome those differences? What are the changes in the policies, practices, and procedures? What are the social justice dimensions? That may not be legislated, but may be what is necessary and incumbent upon us to be able to leverage ourselves fully. And what does it mean to create dignity? How much time? Oh, really? Huh, what do you know? So when they work, these initiatives work. We are aligning the initiatives with the larger vision and other change processes. We are continually attracting new talents and ideas. We're motivating employees to take ownership, to create and innovate, and we're integrating DE&I with structures, policies, and practices. So I want to make sure that the focus here comes back to you, each of you, and the role that you play as leaders, whether that is a capital L or a small l. And what's incumbent upon leaders to be able to create cultures of inclusion, cultures of belonging, and teams where that is manifested every moment in ordinary ways, is to communicate the vision, be clear about that vision, and demonstrate that in your everyday, our everyday words and actions, to create high-quality relationships where we can all thrive, and to work on everyday self-awareness and self-regulation. One of the games that I play with myself every day, I'm confessing to you, this game that I play is I notice how I'm noticing. And I look for examples of ways in which I'm making assumptions that are faulty. It may mean that sometimes I walk up to a stranger and check something out. I will admit that. But one of the things that we have to all do is model not understanding. We have always been trying to understand and know. What's really important is that we recognize that sometimes we don't understand. A lot of times we don't understand. And that what we need to be is curious. to listen, to show humility, admit our mistakes, and create space for others. So as you think about your work and initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'd like you to think about what are the things that are challenging you? What are the ways in which you are addressing practices that are both practical, that are in the business case, but are also about doing the right thing? And what can you do to recognize that relationships are built on people feeling like they're known, that they're considered, that they matter, and that it's okay to be uncomfortable? Thank you. Are there any questions before I sit down? Yes.
Maya, hold on for the mic.
Thank you, Ilene.
Can you please tell your name, where you come from,
Yeah.
who you are, identify yourself?
There we go. Hi, I'm Maya from the EBRD. Thank you very much, Ilene. I have a question. When you think of your own leadership journey, what would be like your top one advice to your former self?
Oh, what a wonderful question. What would be my top advice to myself? You know, I think the reason that I stress the permission to not understand is that early in my career, when I felt like I needed to prove myself, I really felt like I needed to, I had a harder time being vulnerable. And I think one of the greatest lessons learned over the course of my career is the value of being able to be vulnerable, to embrace others more fully. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you very much.